I'm Rob LeCurio at Award 7. I'm here with two sound technicians on the incredible film Anemone, Steve Fanagan and Stevie Haywood. Guys, first of all, congratulations on your recent British Independent Film nomination for Best Sound. That is very, very cool.
Thank you very much, Steve. Go for it.
Thank you. It was a lovely surprise. Yeah, it's a lovely awards body, so it was great to have this film recognized.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think the best thing about it is you get to go to a nice party. You can put on some nice clothes and you can celebrate with all of your colleagues and peers in the industry. So that's going to be very fun. I hope you win. Stevie, you've said that watching Daniel Day-Lewis's process up close was a privilege that you never expected to have. So talk us through what you meant by that.
well, obviously, growing up, I've watched Daniel Day-Lewis from before I started my career as a sound engineer, back when I was working as a music engineer, and even before that, actually, in the 80s. And I've watched him and been amazed and sort of slightly mystified by by how he does it and what he does. His the immersion that he goes through in order to become these characters. And obviously I was slightly curious about all the rumors about how far that went. And the stories that I'd heard along the way of quite extreme behaviour back in the good old days. So I was incredibly excited and honoured to be working with Daniel, especially because he's made a handful of movies really. So
Yeah.
it was very exciting to and also because he was technically retired, and the fact, and so he was coming out of retirement and it was all super secret. And so, yes, I was extraordinarily honored to have seen how he does it and how that manifests itself, the total immersion in a character, and how because I just couldn't really imagine how you could reconcile
Yeah.
being this person, another person, while you're being filmed. You've got all these filming things going on, and a lot of stuff was done in order to help him not come out of character and to stay in the zone. We went to a great deal of trouble to make that work for him. But obviously, at the end of the day, you've got a microphone in the air and you've got a camera in your face. And so how does that process actually manifest itself? And now I think I know.
You know, what a great experience of all the actors on Earth. I think that's the one that most people would just be like, geez, it'd be so cool to work with him. Well, you guys can tick that now off your bucket list. Steve, with Anemone, what I was most striking to me is there's a lot of that the quiet loneliness. Obviously, that's the story, most of it, and particularly with Ray. How do you use ambient natural sounds like wind, trees, water, whatever it may be, to reinforce Ray's internal state when he's alone for lengthy parts of the film?
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about that is it was very much part of the writing. So when you read those first 10 pages of the script, there's no dialogue, right? So Ronan and Daniel in their writing had really described this space and this place and this feeling. And I suppose, my first conversation with Ronan was very much about that. It was like this beautiful in for our first conversation because there was so much sound material on the page, which I guess is kind of rare for a script. Often, you're into dialogue, you get descriptions of what things look like, but it's not necessarily about mood and feeling to do with sound. And so very quickly we knew that weather would be a character in the film. And from talking to Ronan in that initial conversation and then through the work, we just began to explore what a particular type of wind could do to the feeling of a moment, or what particular combinations of winds. And I suppose what you're always trying to do is figure out how to evoke a feeling from the audience that's true to the image on screen, true to the story that's evolving on screen. Um, in some ways, with this film, because we know we're going to culminate in this epic storm, um, it felt really like a brilliant opportunity with weather to start putting small building blocks of that storm into the film early on and developing them over time so that by the time we get to that moment, which is kind of the transformational moment in the film for our four main characters, that we're maybe coalescing a sound idea that's been sort of breadcrumb trailed along the course of the film. And yeah, I think having a director that is thinking that way before they've even shot a frame, and having sort of this incredible cinematography and these beautiful locations and performances to play off just kind of gave us every opportunity to do that. And, you know, I think part of that as well is that Stevie and his team had captured this really elemental sound on set. So when there wasn't dialogue, they had gone to painstaking measures to capture footsteps and creaks and breath and tiny utterances, all that non-verbal information, which gave us this anchor that meant that we could kind of hang anything on it that felt appropriate, if that makes sense.
Mm.
It definitely does. Let's
I,
talk about the
I
storm.
was going to say if I
No,
could
go
just
for it.
add
Yes, please.
there, because but from what Steve just said, having read hundreds of maybe thousands of scripts over my career, that was that particular script had so much stage note and detail in it that I can honestly say I've never read a script like that before, where you can see an entire page of stage direction and very sort of visceral explanation of what the shots needed to be. It was much more intense than any other script that I'd read. Normally, a lot more of that is left to be directed, but they had obviously created the image of everything that needed to be done completely in their heads beforehand and then written it down. And I hadn't seen anything quite like that before.
Wow. So before I move on, that's really interesting because obviously every film's different and some sound design is really locked in from very early on, like a blueprint, and often it's found in post. And it just really will depend on a whole variety of factors, right, Steve? I'm just wondering then on this film, given what Stevie's just explained about the script, um, t talk me through that process about how a lot of it was pre-thought through, but then obviously you've had to make certain adjustments with what Stevie was able to capture on location.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose, like what's in the script is this very detailed idea of the weather doing something and feeling a certain way. And I think the challenge then in post for myself and Ronan and our other close collaborator, his editor Nathan Nugent, is then to try to figure out what sounds best express that. And so in a way, like the script gives you this kind of beautiful jumping off point where you kind of know what's required emotionally, and then you're trying to figure out what sounds to use to express that. So, you know, the process on this was, gathering as much sound as I could, going out and recording. I live quite remote in the countryside in Ireland, so I did a lot of local recording. We had quite a few storms last year, which, whilst not been pleasant to live through, made for good material to record. And then I suppose one of the things, like we began talking very early, myself and Stevie, before anything got shot, and I had been talking to Ronan before that. And so we're thinking from that point onward about things to collect and things to gather. And I started to share stuff with the cutting room early, like I built them a library of things I thought would be useful as Nathan was assembling. And then Ronan had asked that sound start early. So I started before director's cut and continued through for several months working in parallel with the picture. So the sound work then evolves, and because we've got a good chunk of time and pictures changing, nothing feels too precious. And so experimentally, we feel quite free.
Mm.
Ronan was very open to ideas, so I felt like I could take a risk. And if something was totally off the wall, or maybe not appropriate, I knew I wasn't going to get scolded. It was encouraged, and so by being able to kind of explore things in that with that freedom and with that encouragement, and then getting the feedback from the cutting room, whether that was us having a conversation, or if they were too busy, they would send me back work. I'd see how they'd used it, and we'd work on the next iteration. And so over time, you're kind of evolving something. You don't have to have the answer right away, which means that there's an opportunity to explore things that are maybe less obvious. And I think this film, there was definite appetite for that, to try to figure out something that was really elemental and different and hopefully unique to the film and appropriate for the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Stevie,
I
anything to
mean,
add to that?
I was going to say that although there was a lot of detail, especially written visual detail, and some hints towards sound design, and in the initial conversation as well with Ronan, he talked about the weather being like a fifth character in the film. To think of it like that. And so, having had a conversation very early on with Steve, which is, as Steve said, was quite unusual. I'm normally, I rarely get to speak to sound post, or certainly not at the beginning, or certainly not before we start filming. So we were able to coordinate what we were going to do. And ordinarily, when I'm on location recording sound, I'm trying to minimize everything except for dialogue, trying to minimize all the other sound and remove a lot of that as much as possible. Whereas on an enemy, we we were doing the opposite really. We were trying to capture all these extra bits that we'd have normally been trying to manage more. Um, and although Ronan had a very sort of clear idea about how what he wanted and how he wanted things to work, he didn't necessarily limit how we would get to that point. He was very open to suggestion on how you might get to a certain point and we might be able to capture a performance or affect a performance. So he had a very clear idea about how he wanted things to turn out, but the route to that was a very sort of collaborative process. And
Mm.
indeed, we did use again. Steve had created some effects and what have you for us to use on location, which is again very unusual, so that the actors could. The storm, for example, there was a temp version of the storm which we used in one moment for well in several moments actually, but in the one moment in particular to give them more of to give them something to perform against, so they could
Yeah.
very much put themselves in that position. And we also we just tried to make any sounds that might happen in their world. We tried to keep them as true to the time period as possible. It's set in the sort of early mid 90s, so we tried
Hmm.
to always give them sounds. Again, even things like a scene where there was no dialogue, we would still have like music playing or something going on, and it would be something that was appropriate for the time. All of those, those little moments were captured, and I'd like to think that helped them sort of stay in the 90s, right, and we tried to protect them as much as possible from the modern world. And certainly the locations that we chose were very useful for that because they were quite remote on the whole.
Yeah, that is so interesting. My initial reaction to those comments are that, of course, everybody has their specific role to play in the sound team, but I think a lot of that bleeds in together. Like you're doing designing as well, Stevie, and Steve, you are capturing, and of course, one is focused on post, one is focused on pre and during production. But it's so interesting on this film that it appears that you all really collaborated more so than perhaps what you might have done in other films, which brings me to this. The storm, like just from my subjective perspective, when I saw the film, was like a valve had gone off. Like the film is such a pressure cooker, and finally we get this physical and emotional threat and breakdown. It's really cathartic, and it's also really compelling to the narrative. I'm just curious, Steve, firstly, what was the priority in capturing and then mixing the sound of the storm so that it really hits hard?
Yeah, it was something that was the first scene that I worked on, and I don't know if it was the last scene that I worked on, but it certainly was evolved and worked on through the whole process. And I think it went through a few different iterations where there was music on it at one point, and so then naturally the sound would have recessed and music would have led. But Ronan ultimately decided that he wanted something very physical and very elemental. And as you say, it's like this cathartic release. So the idea that it kind of had to shake the life into them or into Ray and show him that there was only one way, one decision to make. Felt really important. I think the biggest challenge from a sound point of view with sequences like that is when something starts loud and needs to continue loud, and it's over several minutes. You can't, like, the sound has to change and evolve, and you have to create waves so that the audience never loses the intensity. Part of what was really helpful in that was that we switch locations. So, we go from Brian's room to Nessa's call center workspace to Ariel above the forest to the pharmacy, then to the forest. So one of the challenges was trying to figure out how to make the storm feel as big in each location, but then to try to change sonically how it sounded so that we would get that natural change of environment, which would allow us, the audience's ears, not to tune out. You get a little
Mm.
reset. We could kick it each time so that it would stay loud, but to also kind of have it be different enough that you felt sonically, geographically, that you were moving around, and I suppose that you were subjectively experiencing it from each character's point of view. So it was a fascinating challenge, and there are lots of unusual sounds in there that aren't naturally what you would expect from a hailstorm, but it's not really a hailstorm that I think that any of us could have experienced. The difference between there was a hailstorm here the other day and it was intense, but the hail was like, this big. In this, we're talking like baseballs, or so to find that sound was a really interesting thing. Our Foley crew did an amazing job of just figuring out different items to throw at glass and at bits of corrugated iron. I took apart a metal shed and used bits of it to try to create contact mic sounds and other ambient recordings of, you know, I took every kind of like like weights, gym weights and things like that to throw into mud to see if just to try to get the scale of the impact, because that was sort of the challenge of it, and for Ronan, it could never be loud enough. So it was about trying to make sure that we had enough variety and enough detail to keep that interesting.
That's what I
Um,
mean, for my experience of watching the end product, one of the things I really enjoyed was the amount of how much attention you'd paid to dynamic range. It really does, not only are you changing the sounds changing and evolving and from different perspectives, but also there are huge jumps in the dynamics of different situations and giving people because you hit those superlatives really quickly, don't you? I mean, you could big, bigger, biggest, and that's it. Where do you go from there? And so
Yeah.
then it's about resetting people and giving them a second to breathe and then battering them again. It was an extremely dynamic roller coaster, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Well, it's so
yeah,
great to hear that. But, obviously that's built into the writing and built into the direction and the way the picture's cut. So you're kind of constantly responding to clues you've been given by the material, and then obviously working through it with your director. And Ronan ultimately had for a director to have on their first film to have such a sophisticated idea about sound, not to mention all of the other departments, but to have that idea and to see the opportunity to go down to something as quiet as a breath or a small little chair creak in some cases, and then in other cases to have this kind of epic, almost world-ending storm, and to be able to figure out, like, I think one of the things that I found really interesting about the storm was that when we get to the end of it, we cut to black and we go silent, like literally
yeah.
digital silence. So I think even that allows it feel louder than it was, if that makes sense. And that's built into Ronan's filmmaking, and it's built into the way that they cut the picture. And I get to benefit from that because they've set it up in this way that it adds to how it plays for an audience, I think.
Absolutely. And you know what else? After the storm, like I thought, okay, that's the crescendo of the film. No, no. Then we have the monologue about the revenge, about Ray's revenge. and that is the gut punch of the whole picture, and it has to really, really fly. How do you treat the soundscape around his voice? Do you use effects to echo it? What are you doing there? Because it really does work, and I think the sound has a lot to do with it.
Well, I think a huge part, like, I mean, it's so important to mention that in those scenes, we are only using production sound. So
Wow.
Stevie and his team have captured these performances in these like absolutely treacherous, inclement environments. So
Yep.
like, you look at some of those locations and you think, oh God, there's not going to be anything that we're going to be able to use from here just by looking at the wind. Like take that beach scene. Like if you look at the way the wind is blowing there, you just kind of think, how on earth and what you can see, what's not perfectly clear in the picture is that it's raining on and off through that. And I'm only really aware of it because I can hear it on their raincoats. And Tim Hans, our dialogue editor, did some beautiful work to minimize that. But I think ultimately actors' performances are in their voice. It's in whether that's verbal or non-verbal stuff they're doing with their mouth, in the same way that all of us do, and that in tandem with their body language is like how we understand them, right? Just like how we understand each other in any daily circumstance. So to have the voice so beautifully captured on set means that we have this. The performance is there, the essence of that performer is there, of the character, Ray's voice, Jem's voice, Brian's voice, Nessa's voice. It's all been captured, and so when you have that in a beautiful place before you do anything to it, um, it means that you then have room to just sprinkle around it. So in the dunes, Ronan really we played around with a little bit of an echo because I think sometimes when you're in that beach type of environment, there's a strange slap that happens. It's you'd never get it in a concrete space. And so we played around with that in places, but it only kicks in if their voices hit a certain volume. So you're never going to hear it on Jam in that scene because he's speaking under his breath and he's just being understanding. But for Ray, at times when the emotion takes over, or he gets uncomfortable about how emotional he's being and then maybe gets a bit caustic or shoots Jam down, those bits get a little bit louder and that's what kicks the echo off. So it's very minimal, but something that Ronan really liked and something we thought was effective, like this idea that Ray could project a little bit in that space. And then it's just about trying to find the right combination of wind in sand and grass and in their clothing to sort of just feather around it. And I think not get in the way of the dialogue, but make the dialogue feel like it's sitting in that space. And I think with any of those scenes, when you think about the most intimate conversations you've ever had in your life, they can happen in very chaotic spaces, but it's very easy for your ear to tune the world out and just hone in on the person you're talking to. And so I think in all of those scenes, there's a very natural point where you begin to pull everything other than the voice out, or pull everything other than the voice and maybe some Foley movement, so that we feel really intimate and close with the character as you would if you were engaged in that conversation with them. And then, as the conversation ebbs and flows, the sound can come and go. But again, that's really only possible when the dialogue is clean, where you don't have a noise floor you're competing with. Because often you might be competing with sound, natural sound on set in such a way that you cannot come down to those silences. So I can't really compliment Stevie's work enough on the film. And I think as well, when you've got actors who are so performance based, the idea of being able to recreate that somewhere down the road is just, like all of them are brilliant at ADR, but it's just a tool that you want to use as minimally as possible when the performance has been that elemental and pure in the way that the film is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Stevie.
Yeah, but it was, I mean, that day in particular, that was probably our most challenging day in the location. It threw everything at us. There was every kind of weather that day, driving wind and rain, but then the sun would come out and it would be extremely hot, and it literally, the weather was it was a very interesting day in the way it progressed because it did kind of help us in as much as it started off really badly to the point where it couldn't even film to start with, and then it started to get slightly better, and we were able to sort of mess around putting up various covers and trying all the different things out to try to work around it. But I think as he confesses and things start to get better, the weather did actually improve, which helped us tell the story. It actually was a it was that was one of those happy moments of serendipity where things actually work out in your favor. So we go from this awful weather to this slightly better weather, so that definitely was our most challenging environment and most challenging day in terms of what we had to deal with and what the elements threw at us. And also, I mean, from the word go, as Steve said, it was made very clear that Daniel absolutely hated to do ADR and any of these big scenes. You know, would rather not have to do any. And thank goodness he didn't have to. But yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And like he was open to it if the film needed it, but obviously if there was a way for and if there was a way for us to work with what we had, and Tim Hans was very creative in the dialogue edit with just finding tiny little bits of all takes here and there where maybe we had the wind blow up on a syllable or two, or but again, the fact that it was there in those raw recordings meant that we could do that, and the fact that their performances were so consistent, it meant that we could go to old takes occasionally and drop a word in or drop part of a word in, and it would work. And it's just golden when that's what you're working with, when that's your start point. It's yeah, it's as good as it gets.
I can imagine. Um, I want to talk about finally recognition of more subtle work in a world that rewards spectacle. So, you know, I know you don't do this work to win awards, but just as a matter of principle, awards often spotlight loud films, musicals, blockbusters, action, adventure. But now and then, a quieter film, and I use that word kind of slightly facetiously, breaks through, like Johnny Byrne won the Oscar for The Zone of Interest a couple of years ago. An amazing achievement, I think, for sound people, because it really showed the Academy was taking notice of subtler work. Does that kind of recognition feel, I guess, important to you guys, that subtler work is often overlooked, but every once in a while, if it's good enough, people will actually notice?
Mm. Well, I think in the case of Zone of Interest, I mean that is the perfect example of where the sound really makes the film. You know, if you remove what's going on over the wall from that film, it's just it's a film of just humdrum domesticity. But you can hear all this stuff in the background, and if you know, without that, just a very different it's a very different movie. And I think that film is a wonderful showcase for what you can do with sound. I am very sort of grateful that in the case of that film that it was recognised and they you know it was heard properly. I'd like to think that most of the time people are going to the cinema to watch our films and getting the full experience. I imagine that a lot of people aren't. They might be watching things on laptops or even phones. Who knows? But the you know the a film like Zone of Interest and an Enemy would you know if you really want to experience it properly, you have to see it in the cinema. It's the only way you're going to get that dynamic range and the bottom end and everything that's going on. You need that theatrical experience.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said, I think, for being in the dark with other people watching something collectively. And you know, you can't take out your phone because you're going to upset someone else. There's an etiquette to it. So to remain fully immersed is important. And I think, yeah, like it's Johnny's work is phenomenal, and it's so brilliant to see he and the crew get nominated for that. But you know, the other film I could think of in recent times that was nominated, not you know, it's in the last whatever 10 or more years, but There Will Be Blood is a great example of of what might be considered a quiet film, but it's actually just an incredibly detailed, incredibly specific piece of sound work. So I think, I think if a film gets widely seen and the sound work is sort of authentic and honest and true to it, then it often will be recognized, and that's a beautiful thing. I do think also everyone who does our job appreciates how hard it is to do a quote unquote quiet film, because you don't have wall to wall music to hide behind, or you don't have the explosion or whatever might be happening. You may be down to whether or not a breath reads well or not. You may be down to whether a whispered line of dialogue is clear or has the right environment behind it. So I think, I definitely think anyone who toils in this game will understand that, and it's brilliant to see Johnny's work on Zone of Interest and the filmmaking just be recognized, because again, like, what an incredible idea from Jonathan Glazer to have sound as this the only thing that tells us about the concentration camp and about the horrors, like, is the sound, like, and the detail and the sort of lens that Johnny went to understand how to make that read, or just it's impossible not to be inspired by it. And the fact that he's a lovely person in my experience as well is even better.
Yeah, that helps. That
Yeah,
really does.
so great.
Yeah, it reminds me of like a recent film that Banshee's been sharing. It's like the sound work on that film is like A plus, and yet most people would probably not associate that film as a film with, exceptional sound. They're probably thinking of The Avengers, and that's just the way
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is.
yeah.
But it's really exciting for film lovers like me when those kinds of films break through. And on that note, I really believe I saw an enemy in a theater, in a dark theater. It was very, very, very confronting seeing some of those scenes. It was beautifully done, guys. You did such an amazing job. So on that note, thank you for your time today and congrats again.
Thank you
Thanks so
very much.
much. Really appreciate it.